Okay, greetings. My name is Chris Zirkle, and welcome to Engaging Students with Podcasting. We're going to go through some content here for hopefully about an hour. I'll get through. We'll stop every now and then to check the chat for questions and comments. And let me go ahead and paste in the chat the links that you'll need for this session and everything that is there for you. If you do need support with anything, there are some email addresses that will provide you with email addresses to get support, like, for example, attendance or registration, things of that nature. But let's go ahead and jump into our content. We talked about the app and using that for attendance at the end. And we'll go ahead and let you know you're engaging students with podcasting. We're going from 9:30 to 10:50. And here's some ways that you can get a hold of me if you like. There's my Twitter handle. I do have 2 podcasts. The one podcast, if you're listening to any of them, would be the Wake County Public School System Digital Learning. That's our formal podcast we distribute to all the teachers and staff members in our county. There's my email address. I also have my website and my YouTube channel. I really would point you towards my email address if you have any questions about this session, if you need any support down the road, whether you work for Wake County or not, feel free to email me. I love talking about podcasting. We'd love to help you out. And if you want to eventually share some of your podcast episodes that you have produced with your students, feel free to send them my way. I'd love to hear what you've been able to produce. So we're going to do a little icebreaker activity. This will kind of give us a chance to introduce ourselves and give everyone a moment to join as well. So I pasted in the chat a link to this Padlet. And you're going to go to the Padlet and just answer a couple of questions. If you want to add something besides what's here, you feel free to. But maybe your name and your position, whether you're a teacher or in education, describe maybe any experience you have with podcasting, maybe some of your goals, hopes, or dreams related to podcasting. If you want to do that in a video format, feel free to. If you want to add an image, you're welcome to. But let's go ahead and hop over to our Padlet and take a look. We got people answering here. We'll give you a few minutes to do that. And feel free to read each other's post. Okay, so it looks like most of you are wanting to podcast to work with your students, and that is great to hear. Some of you are wanting to do your own podcast as a professional to provide podcasts to teachers. This session will be applicable to whether or not you're podcasting solely with your students or you yourself want to podcast. Everything we talk about will apply to either direction, but our session really is targeting engaging students in podcasting. We're going to review the objectives. I see we have teachers from all over the state here today, and some of you have a little bit of experience. Some have, we're just kind of starting out. So we want to establish what our objectives are for this session. You're going to be able to lead a lesson about podcasting. So you'll be equipped to lead your students through podcast lessons. You'll know the podcast workflow. We'll go through that together here in a few moments. You'll be able to record, edit, and publish a podcast, although the editing part may need a little bit of additional support. That can be a little bit of a challenge. And then your students will be able to plan, record, and produce their own unique podcasts. I do have the ISTE standards there as a reference. I won't read through those. I'll let you peruse those on your own. But let's go ahead and look at the digital book that I've created for this session. Katie Haywood is the co-host of the podcast that we do for our county. We present using this resource, and we're really going to kind of step away from the slides now and be in this resource the rest of the session. So what I'm going to do here is go ahead and pop one more time in the chat in case you didn't get the link. There is a link to this session resource, and you want to go ahead and open that up now. And we will go ahead and start going through the content. And again, the goal is to hopefully provide you about 15-20 minutes to be able to dive in to either the workflow or using Anchor to do some practice recording or reviewing any of the activities we go through. So the big picture, I call it the podcast process. This is the process I use personally, is we start off with a student workflow, and that's really where the engagement really connects with students. There's so many roles and different things for students to find, to connect to, that they'll be able to find a place in this process that they're excited about. And it's really the bulk of the work is in the workflow. And once we get the workflow done, then we go into recording, then editing, which most likely is going to fall on the teacher hands unless you have software that students have access to. And then, of course, publishing, that's most likely going to be the teacher. You want to preview anything that you're going to actually publish, listen to it entirely before you click on that button that sends it out to all the platforms. And podcasting, I like to define it as basically someone, if you call that person the talent or a host, maybe interviewing somebody, maybe discussing a topic or telling stories. And this has been recorded and is then sent out to your audience via the internet on various platforms. And podcasting usually has some equipment such as a microphone, recording device, a computer, some software, and a podcasting platform. And we'll go through each of these here today. There are two types of podcasts. There is the traditional podcast and non-traditional. And you may be here for one of these two. So let's talk about the traditional. That is when you're looking to build an audience outside of your school walls. You want to be on platforms like Anchor and Spotify and Google Meet and all the other platforms that Anchor distributes to. And you're looking to have seasons, and within these seasons, you're going to have multiple episodes. And maybe you're going to be publishing those. For example, ours goes out every Tuesday, and we do a weekly, or maybe you do a bi-weekly or monthly. Now, non-traditional, you're not trying to build that audience. You're not looking to be on Spotify and Apple and Google. You just want to maybe do a project or an assignment or maybe even an assessment with your students, and maybe it's just a one-time deal. Either way, you'll still go through the whole process. So everything that we're going to say today will apply to either traditional or non-traditional. The only difference is when you publish, you would publish differently. And I do want to point out at the bottom of this page are 50 ideas for a student podcast. So if you need a jump start on where to begin with students, you can peruse those 50 ideas, and hopefully that'll give you some ideas, or even your students to look at some of those ideas. But let's look at the benefits of engaging students with podcasts. It's not just engaging them, but there's a wide variety of benefits that tie into your curriculum and your content. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to get quiet here for about a minute or two. I'm going to allow you to go ahead and just peruse and scan these benefits. There are 3 pages, and find maybe one, maybe two that really resonate with you, get you excited, and maybe something you hadn't realized before is a benefit. And if you want to, you can post in the chat the benefit that you connected with or find will be beneficial for your students. So I'll get quiet here for a moment and allow you to read through these, and we can go ahead and do that now. And just to interrupt you, Mom, sorry to interrupt you. My assumption is that you have the book open. Um, so I'll go ahead and turn the page just in case you hadn't had it open. But you do want to have that book open on a tab that you can refer to, because we'll be going back and forth throughout the session to some of the links. So if you want to post something in the chat, if you want to unmute, if anything stood out to you, was eye opening, or something that excites you, feel free to post in the chat or just quickly unmute and share before we move on. Okay, so we got some responses in the chat, and if you weren't able to go through all those in that allotted time, um, that's one reason to provide you with this resource, is so you can reflect on some of the content that's here and go back and look over it. But we are going to move on just because of the bulk of content we have to go through, and us wanting to have some time for you at the end. So let's look at the big picture of the student workflow. Uh, this is a cycle that is repeated. It starts off with brainstorming, and the first time the students go through the process, and we're going to go through this together, you're brainstorming the concept of the podcast, which is really the starting point. You got to get that concept down, the format, and the podcast anatomy. And then each time you go through this cycle, you don't repeat the first three because you've established those, but you would repeat this cycle for each individual episode. So it's used not only for the start of it, but also as you go through your season if you're doing a traditional. Once you've done all the brainstorming, what students can do individually or they can do as a group. I like to have them do it individually and then come together as a group and share their brainstorm ideas. That way, each student is able to participate and get their ideas out there. Then you go into research, and you're researching. I call them subject matter experts. Your students need to be subject matter experts, or your guests need to be subject matter experts on whatever the topic is. So there needs to be some research and some preparation done. Then we go into the writing stage, where we do some formal writing of the schedule, of the podcast anatomy, and of the script and talking points. Then you, as a teacher, are going to meet with your groups, approve what's been done so far. Then once you've approved it, they would move on to rehearsing their bumpers, their script, their questions, and their talking points. And then for each episode thereafter, they would then repeat the process of brainstorming, research, writing, and rehearsal. Excuse me. So I like to ask these questions. Anytime you see a link, you just click on that link, and it's going to open up a resource you can make a copy of and share with your students. You can modify and change it to meet your needs. But before we discuss the format anatomy of podcasting, I like to just kind of throw these questions at you, so that when we go through the next section of content, you have some questions you're trying to find answers for. So let's go ahead and let me just read these out loud, and just take a few microseconds in your mind to think of the answer. And then as we go through the next stage, hopefully you'll find some answers to these questions. But why are you podcasting, or your students? What format will you use? What will the podcast be about? How will I engage my audience? How will your podcast be different than others? How long will each episode be? Research to see if there's any podcasts that already exist, and can you add a new spin or twist to make yours unique? What will be the title of your podcast? Who is the author or authors that you'll include in your description? Will you have guests on your podcast? And will you produce more than one? So we'll go ahead and go through the formats. Now, I generally don't read verbatim when I'm presenting. I just kind of have bullet points, but these formats are so specific, and there's kind of a explanation of each format, that for this section only, I am going to read what's here, just so we are precise on the description of each one. And the pattern will be there. Excuse me. There are 9 podcasts. I better take a little sip here. There are 9 podcast formats, and each one I have a sample of that format. So those images are actually links to podcast episodes. One of the best ways to learn about podcasting is listening to podcasts. So you may want your students to listen to various formats to help them decide which one they want to use. That link next to podcast formats is a document that lists everything that's here. And we'll start with the interview. An interview style podcast episode features one or more students that interviews a guest or subject matter expert. And the host or students usually begin their episode with brief introductions, and then move on to the prepared questions. The questions asked of the guest usually tie back into the topic or theme. And there are pros and cons for each of these formats. The pros will be your subject matter expert or guest does most of the speaking. The conversation can be casual, and your guests may actually help grow your show. Whereas the cons, it's very popular, so it's hard to stand out. Booking guests can be challenging, and you're relying on your guests for good content. The solo or monologue podcast, this particular podcast format is common. Podcasters that are subject matter experts themselves use this format. It's simple format because the host does all the speaking. Planning of each episode is important. Some podcasters or students are able to ad lib, while others may have outlines or scripts. The pros is that a student runs the entire show, your audience gets to know the student well, and editing is streamlined with one speaker. Cons is the student has to do all the speaking, the student needs fresh material or content, and the student may need to rehearse before recording. The conversation / co-host is a common format and involves 2 people having a straightforward conversation who generally have great chemistry together because of their personalities, knowledge, experience, and skill set. Unlike an interview podcast format, however, these 2 people are both hosts of the podcast. Each of these hosts may take on different roles during the podcast. And while working on the production of the podcast, it's good practice to have conversations about who will take on specific roles. It may take trial and error to discover who's best for each specific role and task during the podcast workflow process, recording, editing, and production phase. And the pros would be that the roles and responsibilities are divided between the two hosts. The audience may enjoy the natural flow of authentic conversation. And cons is it may require more work to edit two voices as opposed to just one. The panel is a show very similar to the interview podcast. The main difference is that there are more guests or subject matter experts. For example, a student or a couple of students interviewing a group of teachers. Your guests may be members of a business, or your panel could be a group of students. The pros is each student is unique because you have a new panel each episode. The student host asks the questions and the panel does most of the speaking. The cons are finding new panel guests can be challenging and a lot of work to organize, and that is so true. You need to keep the panel talking and engaging the audience, and the amount of editing increases with the number of people you have participating in the podcast episode. The nonfiction storytelling documentary is a podcast episode about real life events. For example, historical events could be retold as stories in this format. Students can tell an entire story in one episode or continue the story over several episodes. In this format may also sound like news reports. The pros is that the format can be very engaging for your audience. Students can be very creative by adding sound effects, music, and other creative elements. And there's an abundance of content students can use for their episodes. The cons is the duration of each episode may fluctuate. Students need to be accurate with their details and storytelling. The format can be very time consuming for students and teachers. And this format can be difficult for a small team to complete in a short period of time. We have podcast theater, which is also known as fictional storytelling. Some stories may be told across several podcast episodes. Some of these are like dramatic TV shows, and some are narrated by a single student. Some students will use multiple sound actors, sound effects, and other theatrical elements. These podcasts generally follow the traditional fictional 5-stage plot. The format is perfect for students that are very creative. They can create the characters, the plot, and even worlds. The pros of the audience tend to follow your students' podcast show because of the threaded story that's told over multiple episodes. This is not a very common format, so it's easy to stand out. The cons are building an audience can take time to grow. Your students will be competing against TV shows, YouTube, and movies. If your story is threaded over multiple episodes, you'll need to plan out your entire season in advance. And the format is very difficult for students that are not creative. Repurposing and recap. This content format is when students take already existing content and material and alter or transform it to make it entertaining, relevant, and engaging to the audience. For example, students could repurpose movies, books, speeches, the news, problems, inventions, or historical events. Pros, students may have an easier time planning episodes because they are repurposing existing content or material, and students can be creative by adding a unique twist or concept to their show. And the cons are that students will need to engage their audience with content they may have already viewed, read, or listened to. Students need to be accurate with their details and storytelling. This format can be very time consuming, and it can be difficult for small teams to complete in short periods of time. Just the last two educational podcasts are very similar to non-fiction podcasts, but feature educational content. Students can easily repurpose what they're learning to use as content for their podcast, and students will want to be creative in order to engage their audience. Some of the pros are that students can use content they are currently learning in school. The audience of the podcast can learn from the podcast show. And the cons are that the content of the podcast may be niche, which can make it hard to develop your audience. And students will need to be creative in order to engage their audience with educational content. And lastly, a hybrid, which is the type of podcast I use, is for all students and has no rules. Students can be as creative as they want and bend genres and formats in order to create new ones. Students can be presented with the traditional formats and then encouraged to experiment and develop their own. And the pros are students can be creative by experimenting with format options. Students can develop a hybrid format that engages their target audience. And the cons are that students may encounter obstacles and even failure as they work on developing their hybrid formats. And changing your format during your season may affect the following of your audience. Now, that was a tremendous amount of content to go through. And I do apologize for reading that to you. I won't be doing that again this session, but it was just so specific and precise. I wanted to make sure that I was accurate in those descriptions. So we're going to take a few moments to process. We're going to open up the chat. Feel free to unmute and share. And let's just kind of discuss anything we've discussed so far before we move on to the next segment. So I usually get feedback about the formats of teachers not realizing that there are so many, and either that you as the teacher or educator would choose the format for your class as a whole, or maybe you're already thinking of breaking up into small groups. Would you allow students to choose their own format? Would you decide that for them? These are some of the things that I hear teachers are kind of spinning their wheels about.
That's just very cool. I hadn't even thought of a few of these, so thank you. That's very exciting.
Yeah, and you really need to drill this down before you begin your journey with the rest of the workflow. So this is when I would return to the presentation here, and let me get the book open. Oops. And now we'll move on to the anatomy, which to me is really the fun part. Once you get the format, you start working on anatomy. And there's a link right there that you can use to make a copy and give this to your students, either as individuals or as a group. And the first thing you really want to discuss is the title of the show. The title, you want to grab your audience attention. You want the title to kind of give them an idea of what the podcast show is about, but you want it also to be small and catchy. So it's a really creative thing to come up with a title. And we don't like the title of our podcast. We're thinking about rebranding, but it is what it is for now. And then a tagline or description is going to then give your audience a detail about what your podcast is really about. And when you go to put this, if you're doing traditional on a platform, you'll be able to post your write up of your description that goes on your homepage of your channel, so to say. That'll describe your podcast to your audience so they'll really know more what it's about. Now, artwork can be used for two things. Artwork is for your podcast show as a whole, and then you can also have artwork for each individual episode, which really students can get creative with the artwork. And you can use tools like Google Drawing or Canva or Adobe Spark to create your artwork. The podcast season, there's a link there to a sheet that you can use to plan out your podcast season if you're going traditional, because you want to have your number of episodes mapped out, your guest. I'll show you this more formally when we get to the writing stage of what this spreadsheet looks like. But you do want to plan out your season. We've done 3 seasons so far. Each of our seasons generally last 2 quarters. So we have about 16 episodes in each of our seasons, and we take a little break and then we regroup and do another season. And then, of course, each episodes are part of your anatomy that you want to plan out and brainstorm and be creative with, and whether they connect with one another or they build upon each other. Our episodes we're assigned themes by our supervisors for we may have 1 or 2 themes per season, and our episodes have to tie into those themes. And you may do the same thing as an educator. You may give your students some guidance or some ballpark as to what their episodes kind of need to be about, while at the same time giving them freedom to be creative. And bumpers, I love creating bumpers. Bumpers are that intro and outro bumper that are always played at the beginning and end of your show. And what they do is they say the name of the show, maybe a tagline or a brief description of what the show is, who are the hosts of the show, and then your social media tags or accounts, how they can find you, and those are fun to make. Usually, you incorporate music, and we'll actually, if we have time, I'll do a demo of how to make one using Anchor. And show notes, we include show notes for all of our episodes, and we track the data on how many hits those show notes get. Our podcasts are educational. We reference slideshows, we reference websites, we reference videos, and so we also have maybe a write up or a bio of our host or our guest, excuse me, and then we provide a link to those show notes in our podcast that people can click on and then see. So you may want to consider that as well. And at this point is when I would have the students kind of formally answer these questions. Now that they've heard a little bit about the format, they've gone through the anatomy, now they're more likely to have some answers to some of these questions. So that's when I formally would have them actually write the answers to those. And the next is the content. So you want to brainstorm the content of what your episodes are going to be about. So that kind of looks like this here. So I would have, let's say, if I have 8 episodes in a season, or 4, or if it's just non-traditional, it's just going to be 1. What's the title of that episode? What's the description of the episode? And then what's going to be the content? Because you have to have a place to start that we're going to springboard on. The next step of the workflow is research. So if I was doing a podcast about surfing, I would have these, specific questions or discussion points listed, and then that gives me a place to start as far as either researching or finding guests to be able to talk to those points. So let's look back at the big picture here of the workflow. We've talked about brainstorming. We talked about the concept, the format, the anatomy, and the content. And now we're ready to look at research. So we'll take another brief break here and check out the chat to see if there's any questions or comments. Give you a moment to breathe and to process. And then we'll go on to briefly talking about research. So the research, if the students are the subject matter experts, they're going to need to, be able to speak to what the topic is, which you're going to want them to do some research. If your guests are the subject matter experts, you want to prepare them with the talking points or questions and give them to them in advance so that way they can research, and when it's time to record, be able to speak to what it is your episode is about. So let's first look at the student research notes. Nothing really fancy about this, just the title, their source, and notes from that. Typical kind of note card. But the one for the guest, this would be the title of the episode, the description, the guests' names, and be one guest or more than one guest, and the host or hosts. And then the name or guest that's speaking is on the left, and then the question or talking point is on the right. So if you have multiple guests, they know which questions they're going to be asked or which talking points they need to discuss. You give this to them in advance. They have time to prepare, and then we actually have this pulled up when we are meeting, when we're recording. We have everyone has this in front of them to help us with our flow, and we'll talk about flow here in a few moments. So that is a look at research. And then we move into writing, and we're going to formally write the schedule. We're going to formally write the podcast anatomy out, and we're going to formally write the script and the talking points. So here, if you see this link right here, this will take you to the spreadsheet that we actually use. And let me go ahead and pull that up. So you have your record date. This is when you have to think of logistics. When do you have the equipment? When do you have time, a place for your students to record their episode? If they're in groups, you can't record simultaneously because it's loud. So when's the record date for that group? When is going to be the air date? And you want a little bit of time between the record date and the air date because you need time for editing. We need time for you to approve it. You need time for them to possibly make some changes, to rehearse before you air it. And our air dates are very important because we got to air once a week to stay consistent, to build our following, our audience. So we got to drill and make that air date happen. So we do a lot of things in advance. The episode number, the title of the episode, the topic, any guests you may have, a description of the podcast episode, a link to the recording. So you want to have a link that's not on the actual platform. You don't want to post your recording until it's approved. So I recommend posting or uploading the audio file to Google Drive, letting it be heard by who's going to approve it. Show notes, links to the actual show notes. And for us, we send a link to our recording and our show notes to our supervisors. They review, they give us sometimes feedback or changes to make. And when that box is checked is when we can post. And we can't post until that's checked. And you as a teacher want to do the same thing. You want to make sure you listen to everything from beginning to end in the podcast episode before it gets posted on any platforms that go out, because it is representing your school. So that's a look at the actual, let me get back to our book here, formal writing of the schedule. And then you have your anatomy. So now we nail down that show. And this is why I like to give the anatomy brainstorm page to each individual student. They bring that page to the formal writing of the anatomy. And you have 4 students in a group, you have 4 show titles to choose from. You have 4 descriptions, you have 4 artworks, and everyone was able to participate. So that's why I like to assign that individually. So then you get all these formally written out, and we looked at what that looked like earlier, our anatomy, this page here. You have that filled out. And your students are now getting ready to move on to the script and the questions, the talking points. And one thing I'll say about that script and those talking points or questions is you also want them to include any audio files that are part of that, and any sound effects would be part of the script. Much like if you're writing a script for a play, you would have, certain cues and stage movements and things like that included. You want every aspect considered when they write it formally. And that brings us back to this workflow here. You're at the writing stage, getting ready to go to rehearsal. And before you let students rehearse, you want to make sure you meet with them and review their formal writing. So you have an idea of what the podcast show is about. You've seen the talking points or the questions or the script. You see all their anatomy. You see their schedule. And then you put your stamp of approval on it, or you recommend some changes, and they make those changes. And then they move on to rehearsal, because you don't want them to go ahead and start rehearsing something that they have to change. So go ahead and approve everything. They rehearse, and let's look a little bit about what I mean by rehearsing, some important things to consider. And that is the bumpers. So we have currently 3 of our team members involved in our podcast, so we currently have 3 bumpers. The bumpers are the same, but we each take turns recording the bumpers, so we alternate every episode. We alternate, so that way I'm not always the voice of the podcast show doing the bumper. We have different members doing the bumpers, both for the intro and the outro. And ours are short. They're, maybe 30 seconds. We have some really cool music that catches you. And then, of course, you want to look at YouTube to see if you can find some music you're allowed to use in their library or sound effects. That's a good place to go. I happen to pay for licensed music. You can also use Audacity or Anchor or GarageBand to make these bumpers or other software. So bumpers are really fun to make, and you use those at the beginning to kind of kick off your show. And then, of course, rehearsing the script. They're not only rehearsing what's written as far as a script, but their tone, their volume, their cadence, their speech, the speed, the fluency of what they're saying. All these things are important because a podcast show is all auditory. So it's really important that we consider all these elements of voice that they rehearse that. And then the flow, you want the flow to be smooth. You don't want people speaking out of turn or speaking over each other. And that's why it's really kind of important to have something like this kind of outline of who's going to speak and what are their talking points or questions, and you get that flow rehearsed. So let's take another moment to process. I'll go ahead and look over here at the chat and see if there's anything in the chat, any questions or comments. You also can feel free to mute before we get into the technical components of recording in editing and publishing. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to recording. So if we click on this link here that says soundboard, this is our setup for our next season. I return to work in August. I'm really excited. I've been building this studio over the summer. Everything is put together because of the circumstances. Last year, we had to do everything virtually. We're excited about being able to be face to face. And this is our studio. If we look on the right, everything fits on a cart. The studio is mobile. If you look at that soundboard can be plugged in to power, but it runs on batteries. So one thing I'm really excited about is walking into a classroom and going right into the heart, right into the middle of the classroom, not needing to plug into anything and record right there in the midst of a classroom. That's what I'm looking forward to. We use Rode Podcaster microphones, and I have 6-foot cables, and I have 10-foot cables. So I'm limited right now to this desk, this table. You see these that are on. These can all spread out, so we can socially distance these microphones to provide and still have them all plugged into the soundboard. And the soundboard is connected to a computer that uses Adobe Audition that records each microphone separately, so I can control the volume of each microphone with the soundboard, and I can also control and increase and change the volume in the software while I'm recording and also post in editing. I also have a field recorder, which is not in this image, a Zoom H5N that I also record to as secondary backup recording. And the soundboard itself also records to an SD card. So it's overkill, but really I'm looking for that recording that runs through the software so I can level it out. Now, remember that our podcast is for our whole district, all the teachers, the superintendent, everybody in our district. So we have to have a really polished and edited podcast. That's why I'm using this level of equipment. I understand that teachers, we want to be able to use the resources we have access to, and so we'll show you some other options of recording. You don't have to record with this equipment. If you are interested in this equipment, there's a link right here to every item in the studio and its cost. So let's go ahead and look at some other ways to record audio. So what we've done in the past, all 3 episodes or seasons so far, was recorded in Google Meet meeting, just like we're doing right now. We're in a Google Meet meeting. We would all be taking turns saying our parts, and I record with a screencast software, Camtasia. So you can do that. with Google Meet in mind, location, microphones, and environment, with the next four kind of combined, imagine this, that you have 3 or 4 students in a group and they each have a Chromebook and you have your teacher laptop and you reserve the media center, or you have a quiet, as quiet as you can possibly be, room or area where this group of students can record their podcast. And they all meet within the same meeting, but their computers are far enough away from each other, you don't get that squealing feedback, right? They can even be spread out across the campus. And then you, as the teacher, are recording that meeting either with the Meet itself, like Google Meet records itself and Zoom records itself, or like I do, you record with a screencasting software, and then you end up with a video file. And we'll talk about in editing what to do with that. That's one way to go about it. There's other recording options, such as on the right, we have online voice recorder, which is free. We have apps on smartphones and tablets we can record with. Audacity is free. It records and it edits. You could use that. Let me go ahead and turn the page here. Anchor FM, which I'm going to demo for you. I'm trying to go through this content here to get to where I can show you what Anchor looks like and do a demo recording. And maybe that's what you spend your last 15 or 20 minutes doing today is playing around with Anchor. It does everything. It records, it edits, and it distributes your podcast to a wide variety of platforms. I'll mention Google Meet and Screencastify. If you're going to record a Google Meet meeting or a Zoom meeting, I would also suggest you screencast it as a backup. And Screencastify will export that video as an audio file for you. And lastly, OBS, which is what I'm using now to do this presentation, is a free software where you can have a hub, like a USB hub, and plug in a bunch of USB mics like the one I'm using, or a wide range of quality microphones you can get at different prices. And they all plug in, and OBS acts like a soundboard, and you record with OBS. That gives you a video file, which you can convert into audio using some editing software. So let's take a quick moment to check the chat and let you ask some questions or make some comments before we get into editing. Okay, we'll go ahead and proceed. And I do really mean that invitation to email me after the session. When you get down the road and you have questions about this, feel free to. You may have someone in your county or district. I'm a digital learning coordinator. You may have someone like myself in your district you can reach out to for help with recording and editing. We could have done a whole entire session just on one of these editing applications. So editing is not what our session's about, but it is a component about what we're trying to work with. You may have to be the editor unless you have software your students have access to. Obviously, we want our students to edit if they can, but for example, in our county, Anchor is what we use, but Anchor is teacher only, so students aren't allowed to use Anchor. So you want to check with your district to see what software applications are available and also which ones students are allowed to use. Now, the first thing I want to mention about is file conversion, because some of the ways that we recorded were video format. Well, Anchor will let you upload a video and it'll convert it to an audio file for you. Then you can edit it with Anchor and then publish it. Audacity, you'd have to have it in an MP3 file format before you can actually edit it. So you may have to use a video software editor to edit if you recorded a Zoom or Google Meet meeting. And that's how I edit. I use Camtasia, I use Premiere Pro, I use Adobe Audition, I use a wide variety of software to do my editing with that I'm really comfortable with. Adobe Rush is like iMovie. You can edit with iMovie, Adobe Rush, if it's in the video format. So this is another area where you may have to reach out for some support. You can always contact me to ask me some questions, but hopefully have someone in your district that can work with you face to face or virtually to get you through the editing process. And then publishing. We'll kind of wrap up here and get to our demo of Anchor here in a moment. But two ways to publish. If you're traditional, what we use is we use Anchor. Anchor FM is free and it's not a low quality product. You can monetize, which we have turned off. That's probably why our students aren't allowed to use it, because it has that capability to monetize. But I think that's why they're able to offer it for free, because that's how they make their income, is off of monetization. And it'll record, it'll let you do some basic editing, and it'll distribute to a wide variety of platforms such as Anchor, Apple, Spotify, Google, Breaker, Radio Public, Castbox, Overcast, and Pocket Cast. So we are on all those platforms, and it tracks data. We do data analysis and reports. All that's included with it. If you're non-traditional and you still want to go through all the stages of the podcast process, it's just this is where we talked about this being different. When you publish, you wouldn't publish to something like Anchor. You would just maybe save the audio file in Google Drive and share it out that way. In the rest of this resource, I want to show you there are some tutorials, some beginner tutorials for Anchor. So you can peruse those at your will. Add those for you. And at the back are those 50 ideas to get you started with podcasting with your students. And then here's the studio with the supply list and prices. And then here's our contact information. And this will link you here to our podcast, our county podcast. And I was so busy with our county podcast, my personal podcast really isn't current. So I would suggest you listen to our county podcast. So let me hop over to Anchor and do a demo for you. And that way we can get a good 20 minutes of you being able to either work with some of the workflow brainstorming ideas or steps in that, or actually get and create your Anchor account and have you go ahead and create some bumpers or play around with it. But when you first log in, it takes you to your dashboard, and your dashboard looks something like this. So here's my artwork, here's my title, here's my description, here's a link to my website, or I can have a link to show notes, that kind of thing. Gives you all kinds of data and statistics that you can look at. But what you'd want to do is come to a new episode, and we're going to record right in either the app on a smartphone or tablet, or the app on the website on a Chromebook. And let me go ahead and get my script here, and I'll walk you through creating a bumper. Go ahead and hit record here. And I have my microphone selected. I'm going to hit start recording. Welcome to Ed Tech Talk. I'm your host, Chris Zirkle, and today's episode is about engaging students with podcasting. During this episode, we will explore the student workflow, ways to record episodes, discuss editing tools, and look at publishing options. Be sure to take a look at our show notes and follow us on Anchor, Apple, Spotify, or Google Podcast. Now that's going to take a few seconds to process. And on the left here is your library. Here's where all my recordings are. And what's on the right here is when you build your episode. It's all draggable and it's all stackable. And this should take just a couple more seconds. There it is. And I pop this over here. Now I want to add some music to this. So I'm going to hit this add background music. And I want to go to electronic, and Anchor's a Wave. I already know which one I want to use. And I hit apply. That takes a few more seconds to process. And the next thing I would record, I would hit record again and record my episode. And that would go right here underneath this bumper. And then I would record another bumper, which would be my outro bumper. So my episode would be sandwiched in between two bumpers. Let me play this for you now. Welcome to Ed Tech Talk. I'm your host, Chris Zirkle. Okay, it must still be processing. It didn't play the music. You can see the little music icon there. Sometimes I need to refresh in order for that to kick in. But you get the point of it. I can also click on these three dots here, and I can edit that audio, and I can, let's say, take out some ums and ands or dead air, or right here I hit record and I didn't start speaking till here, so I would click here and split, and I would then trash this part, and it would just start playing right here. So that is a quick, like, really 3 or 4 minute look at Anchor. I would save as a new segment. Again, I have tutorials there, but my goal is to give you this 20 minutes. Looks like we have about 24 minutes to be able to dive in and to look at some of the workflow content, some of those brainstorm activities, start planning the show, the concept, the format, or go ahead and create an Anchor account and start playing around with Anchor. There's so much more I can show you on Anchor. But again, our session here is about engaging students, and everything we went over, students will get excited about. It's easy to engage students with podcasting, to be honest with you. Quadratic equations will be a challenge to engage students with, but podcasting is just, students just love it. They jump into it, especially if you come at them with everything I've shared with you, that whole workflow. It's all organized. They all have a role. They work in groups collaboratively, and they listen to podcasts. They hear some they like. They get excited about recording theirs. They have their record date, and then of course their air date. And especially if you're traditional and you're going to put it on Spotify, oh, they'll be into what you're doing. So let me, before I dismiss you for our last 20 minutes, let me come back to the chat. And you just were given a ton of content in about an hour, and I want to give you a chance to either post something in the chat or to unmute and ask any questions or make any comments before we take our next 20 minutes before 10:50. When we wrap up, we'll come back at 10:45 to do the attendance scanning and the feedback form. So any questions or comments in the chat, or feel free to unmute. Now, what's the most popular podcast platform? I would think, especially among teenagers, Spotify. But what the beauty of Anchor is I don't edit with Anchor. I just upload my edited podcast. I hit publish. It sends it for free. It does it for you. It sends it to all the platforms for you. And on our website, a lot of our staff listen to us on Anchor, but we have the links to the platform they can choose. And if they are iPhone users, they may listen on Apple Podcasts. If they're Droid users, they may listen on Google. And an ideal number of per group, you really got to think about managing all of this. You know, if I'm a teacher in a classroom and I have curriculum and I have lesson plans and I have to keep up with my curriculum, how am I going to afford time for my students to do all this work? It's got to tie into the curriculum to justify it, right? So I think about the number of devices I have, the number of microphones. The larger the group, the less number of recordings you have to do, but it could increase your editing. There's a lot of variables. So to come up with a number of students per group, it really depends on some of your circumstances. If you're doing non-traditional, I didn't mention this, and then I'm going to stop talking right at 10:30 to give you time to explore, is that if you're non-traditional, you may not be concerned with editing. You may not mind if there's a couple of moments of dead air, or if someone says, hey, it's your turn, or if they say and a lot. You may just be concerned with the concept of the podcast. Did they do it? Did they come together? All their paperwork and the final product, it got done, and they achieve the objectives you set out for them. So editing may not be that big of an issue. And if it's not that big of an issue, then you can really have, a lot of groups because you're not too concerned about the editing process. But I'm going to honor my commitment to stop at 10:30. I'm going to go ahead and put on this slide here, work time, and right at 10:45, I'm going to mute my microphone as well. I'm going to come back on with the link to the QR code you'll scan for your attendance. And then we'll also have a link to a feedback form, which you already have the feedback form linked in the presentation, but we'll come back then. But I'll stand by my computer, so if you want to chat, we can do that, but we'll go quiet on the speaking. Okay, we are back, and thank you for attending the session. I pasted the feedback form in the chat. I'll show you that again as well. And here is the QR code you need to scan. If you have the slide deck, the next slide below that is the feedback form. I will paste that in the chat here. And back to that QR code for you, though. Sorry. And we have about 4 minutes left. You can do your attendance. You can fill out the feedback form. You can unmute and share anything you'd like or post in the chat. And I'll stay probably a couple minutes after we formally end to see if anyone stayed around to ask or share anything as well. So let me leave the QR code for just one moment to repost that form in the chat one more time. And if you're leaving, I thank you for attending the session. And again, make sure you have my email address. Feel free to email me with any questions that you may have, and if you want to share any of your podcasts. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.